I woke up in a hospital bed in Ottawa with an IV in my arm and no memory of how I got there. The ceiling tiles were white and water-stained in the corner. My mouth tasted like metal. For a few seconds, I thought I was dreaming, the kind of dream where everything is too quiet and too bright at the same time. Then I heard voices in the hallway just outside my room, and the dream ended. My mother-in-law's voice is distinctive. Low, controlled, the kind of voice that never rises even when she's furious. She'd always reminded me of a thermostat set to 60 degrees. Functional, cold, precise. I recognized it immediately through the half-open door. "Does she have access to the account?" she was saying. My sister-in-law answered. She has her mother's voice, just younger and slightly more impatient. The solicitor said, "The power of attorney kicks in after 72 hours. Then we have time." I didn't move. I kept my eyes on the ceiling and I breathed very slowly, the way you do when you don't want anyone to know you're awake. "She signed it at the wedding. She doesn't even remember," my sister-in-law said. Then she laughed. It was quiet and small, and it made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with whatever medication was in my IV. "She'll wake up, and everything will already be done." I heard my mother-in-law say, "Good." Then footsteps and the sound of a door closing down the hall. I lay there for another full minute without moving. My phone was on the nightstand. My husband had left it there when he kissed my forehead earlier and told me the doctors thought it was a severe allergic reaction. He'd looked so concerned. He'd held my hand. I had believed every single word on his face. I picked up my phone, I opened my email, I found the message I had sent myself 14 months earlier with the subject line, "In case I ever need this." I had known. Not exactly. Not the timeline, not the hospital room, not the IV drip or the ceiling tiles. But I had known that something in that house was wrong enough to document, so I typed one text to my notary in Gatineau, a woman I had hired quietly, separately, without telling anyone his family. 3 words, "Start the process." Then I put my phone face down on the nightstand and waited for my husband to come back. "I need you to understand who I was before all of this, because I think it matters. My name is Sabine. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Laval with my mother, who worked double shifts at a long-term care facility for 22 years. We weren't poor in the way that makes the news, but we were careful, we budgeted, we reused, we did not waste. My mother taught me to read contracts before I signed them. She said it was the one thing she wished someone had taught her before her own first marriage. I was 9 years old and I didn't fully understand what she meant. I understood it completely by the time I was 28. That was the year I met my husband at a conference in Toronto. He was presenting a segment on real estate investment trusts. I was there for a colleague's panel on housing policy. He had good posture and he spoke clearly and he asked smart questions at the Q&A. We had drinks afterward and he made me laugh twice in the first 20 minutes, which was not something I experienced often. We dated for 2 years, long distance mostly, him in Vancouver, me in Ottawa. It worked better than it should have. He flew to see me more than I flew to him, which I appreciated. He met my mother and she liked him, which I appreciated even more. The first time I met his family, I drove to West Vancouver in October. The house was on a hill with a view of the inlet. His mother answered the door before we'd even knocked, and looked at me the way someone looks at a used car they're considering, not unkind exactly, but assessing, calibrating, deciding. She shook my hand. She said it was wonderful to finally meet me. She offered me tea. She never once used my name. Over the next year and a half, through holidays and dinners and a long weekend at their cottage in the Okanagan, I noticed this consistently. To my mother-in-law, I was you or she or occasionally dear in a tone that made the word feel like a door closing. My sister-in-law was warmer on the surface but had a habit of directing her warmest comments toward my husband and her mother in a way that subtly excluded me from the conversation. I was always present, I was rarely included. I told myself it was an adjustment period. Some families take time. My mother had liked him immediately, but we were different people and it had been different circumstances. I gave them space. I brought good wine when I visited. I remembered birthdays. I asked questions and listened to the answers. I tried. The problem, and I understood this only later, was that trying read to them as weakness. We got married in June of the following year. Small ceremony, 60 guests, a venue in Kelowna overlooking the lake. My mother cried during the vows. My mother-in-law did not, but I didn't think anything of it then. Different people grieve their children's weddings differently, I told myself. The paperwork happened 3 days before the ceremony. My husband's family had a lawyer. A family solicitor they'd used for decades, a man who came to the rehearsal dinner and made jokes about golf. He brought a small stack of documents to the hotel suite we were staying in the night before the wedding. My husband explained that it was a standard spousal consent form related to his involvement in a family trust. He said the lawyer had explained it all and it was just a formality. He seemed slightly embarrassed about the timing. He apologized for it. I asked to read it. The lawyer handed me the pages and I sat at the desk by the window and I read every line. My husband stood near the door with his hands in his pockets. The lawyer poured himself a glass of water and checked his phone. There was a low-level performance of patience happening in that room that I noticed without being able to name at the time. The document was largely what my husband had described. A spousal consent for a trust distribution schedule. Standard language. I had seen similar forms in my own professional work. But there was one clause, sub-clause, D on page 4, that was not standard at all. It assigned a limited but real power of attorney to the family trust's designated representative in the event that both signatory spouses were simultaneously unable to manage their financial affairs, defined as any period exceeding 72 hours of documented incapacitation. I read it twice. I looked at my husband. He was looking at the window. I signed the document, but before I did, I photographed every page with my phone. I forwarded the photos to my personal email with that subject line, in case I ever need this. Then I smiled at the lawyer and he drove away, and I told my husband I was tired and wanted to sleep before the wedding. I did not sleep for a long time. The first 18 months of our marriage were not unhappy, which is the honest thing to say. There were good stretches. We bought a house together in Canada, which required both our signatures on a mortgage and which I navigated carefully. I had my own career. I worked in regulatory compliance for an in-size financial services firm, and it gave me both income and context that I found useful. I understood contracts. I understood fiduciary relationships. I understood what it meant when someone built a small trap into a document and then asked you to sign it at an emotionally vulnerable moment. I didn't confront my husband about clause D. I monitored things instead. I tracked the trust documentation. I quietly retained my own independent legal counsel, not the family solicitor, not anyone my mother-in-law had ever heard of. My notary in Gatineau, who I had known through a professional connection for 6 years. I gave her copies of everything I had photographed. I asked her to assess my position. She called me back 3 days later. She said, "Sabine, this is not nothing." I said, "I know." She said, "The clause is valid as written. If you were ever incapacitated for more than 72 hours, the trust's designated representative gains access to your shared accounts." I said, "Who is the designated representative?" She said, "Your mother-in-law." I sat with that information for several weeks. I thought about the document, the timing, the lawyer who made golf jokes. I thought about the way my mother-in-law looked at me the first time we met. I thought about the fact that I had never seen the trust's full charter. I thought about my husband standing near the door with his hands in his pockets while I read. I started keeping records, not obsessively, not in a way anyone would have noticed. A folder on an encrypted drive. A log of certain conversations, not recorded because I was careful about what was and wasn't legal in BC, but written down within an hour of their happening, dated, detailed. I noted the time my sister-in-law asked me, very casually at a family dinner, whether I had updated my beneficiary designations since the wedding. I noted the time my mother-in-law mentioned, equally casually, that she had always thought joint accounts were so practical for couples. I noted the time the family solicitor appeared at a barbecue at my in-law's house and spent 40 minutes talking privately with my mother-in-law near the back fence. I did not tell my husband I was doing any of this. I loved him, or I had loved him. The honest answer is that by the time I had filled 20 pages in that encrypted log, what I felt for my husband had become something more complicated than love. Something that still included affection and history and the memory of the man who had asked smart questions at a conference in Toronto, but that also included a grief I couldn't quite name. He was either complicit or oblivious. I didn't know which was worse. 8 months before I woke up in that hospital room, my mother-in-law came to visit us in Canada, ostensibly to help me paint the spare bedroom. She arrived with a gift, a bottle of Niagara ice wine. She was, for those 3 days, warmer than she had ever been. She called me Sabine. She asked about my work. She told me a story about her own early marriage that was actually funny. I was disarmed enough that I almost felt foolish for my encrypted folder, almost. On the second evening, she cooked dinner. I offered to help and she told me to sit down and relax, that she had it handled. She poured me a glass of wine from a bottle she had already opened. My husband was on a work call in his office. My sister-in-law had dropped by unexpectedly around 5, which I noted but didn't mention. I drank about a third of the wine. Then I got up to check on something in the other room and I poured the rest discreetly into the sink. I don't know why I did it. An instinct, or a habit, or the 20 pages in my encrypted log finally speaking up clearly enough to hear. That night I felt slightly off, headachy, mildly nauseous. I went to bed early. My mother-in-law said goodnight and told me it was probably just the dry air. She left the next morning. I went to a walk-in clinic in the afternoon. I didn't tell them why. I said I'd been feeling unwell and asked for a general blood panel. The results came back a week later. There was a benzodiazepine in my system that I had not been prescribed. I sat at my kitchen table with those results for a long time. Then I drove to Gatineau and sat across from my notary and put the lab results on her desk. She looked at them for a while. Then she looked at me. She said, "Sabine, you need to decide what you want to do." I said, "I want documentation of everything I have. I want it organized. And I want to know exactly what my rights are when the time comes." She said, "And your husband?" I looked out her window at the Gatineau River. It was November and the water was dark and fast. I said, "I don't know yet." The time came in March. I collapsed at dinner at my in-laws' house in West Vancouver. I had been careful all evening, careful about what I ate, what I drank, where I set things down. But I had been tired from a long week, and perhaps I was not as careful as I should have been. Or perhaps she had found a delivery method I hadn't anticipated. I still don't know exactly how it happened. What I know is that I woke up in Vancouver General with an IV in my arm and my husband holding my hand, and the doctors telling him it appeared to be a severe allergic reaction to something I had ingested. My husband was the picture of a worried spouse. He had tears in his eyes. And then he stepped out into the hallway to take a phone call, and my mother-in-law arrived, and I heard the conversation through the half-open door, and I reached for my phone. Start the process. Here is what my notary had prepared over the previous 4 months, working quietly and efficiently from Gatineau. She had obtained a certified copy of the full family trust charter, not the excerpt the family solicitor had shown me, the full document, obtained through a legal disclosure request that my mother-in-law did not know was coming. In that charter, Clause D, and its surrounding provisions were accompanied by additional language that the family solicitor had not disclosed to me. The power of attorney triggered by incapacitation was revocable at any time by the incapacitated party's independent legal representative. My notary had filed the necessary paperwork to designate herself as that representative 6 weeks earlier. She had filed it correctly and it had been processed and confirmed. She also had the blood panel results, along with a formal letter from a toxicologist at the University of Ottawa who had reviewed them and provided a written opinion that the level of benzodiazepine detected was inconsistent with incidental or environmental exposure. She had a notarized log of 23 pages of documented incidents, dated and detailed. She had copies of every document I had photographed on the night before my wedding. And she had a separate legal opinion from a BC family law attorney she had engaged on my behalf, outlining my rights regarding marital property, the validity of the spousal consent I had signed, and the specific conditions under which the power of attorney could be contested and annulled. When my notary sent the activation message to the trust's administrative body at 11:47 p.m. on the night I was admitted, the power of attorney never activated. It was preemptively blocked by her filing. By the time my mother-in-law arrived at my hospital room the next morning, with a warm smile and a box of Timbits, nothing she had planned had happened. Nothing could happen. The window had already closed. She stood in the doorway of my room with the box of Timbits and looked at me sitting up in the bed with my phone in my hand, and I looked back at her. I smiled. I said, "Thank you for coming. The doctors say I should be able to go home tomorrow," she said. "Oh, wonderful. We were so worried." I said, "I know. It must have been very stressful for you." She left 40 minutes later. I don't know exactly when she understood what had happened, but I imagine it was sometime around when her calls to the trust administrator started going to a new contact. I imagine the conversation she had with the family solicitor that evening. I imagine her sitting across from him and realizing that the document she had built over years, the clause she had inserted with such careful precision, the timing she had calculated so meticulously, all of it had already been neutralized quietly and legally by a notary in Gatineau who charged reasonable rates and kept immaculate files. I was discharged the following afternoon. My husband drove me home. He was quiet most of the way. Outside Abbotsford, he said, "I didn't know about the wine." I said, "I know." He said, "I knew about the document, the clause, I should have told you." I looked out at the highway. The mountains were still snow-capped. It was a clear day, which felt wrong for the conversation we were having. I said, "Yes, you should have." We drove the rest of the way without speaking. The next 3 months were the most difficult, and also, strangely, the most clarifying of my life. I retained the BC family law attorney for myself directly. My husband hired his own counsel. There were conversations, some of them hard, some of them harder than that, about what he had known, and when he had known it, about how much of his silence had been cowardice, and how much had been something more deliberate. I don't think I will ever have a fully satisfying answer to that question. What I have instead is a settlement that is fair to me, a separation that is legally clean, and a clear record of everything that happened in case anyone ever needs it. My mother-in-law's lawyer sent a strongly worded letter attempting to characterize my documentation and my notary's filing as adversarial and premature. My notary sent back a letter that was 3 pages long and extremely polite, and contained so many references to specific statutes and dated filings that the strongly worded letter was never followed up on. I keep a copy of that exchange in a folder I labeled simply "No." I moved back to Ottawa in July. I rented an apartment in the Glebe, close enough to the canal that I could there in the mornings. My mother came to visit in August and we sat on my balcony and drank coffee, and she asked me how I was really doing. I said, "I'm okay. I think I'm actually okay." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I taught you to read contracts." I said, "You did." She nodded, like that was enough. Like that was, in fact, the entire point. And I thought about the 2-bedroom apartment in Laval, and the double shifts, and everything she had decided to teach me when I was 9 years old and couldn't yet understand why. I thought about a woman who had learned something the hard way, and made sure her daughter would not have to. The encrypted folder still exists. I update it periodically, not because I expect to need it, but because the habit feels right now. It feels like something my mother taught me without knowing she was teaching it, that attention is not paranoia, that documentation is not suspicion, that knowing where you stand is not the same as assuming the worst. It is, in fact, the opposite. It is how you stay standing. My notary sends me a card every December. This past year she wrote simply, "Stay well, you earned it." I have it on my fridge next to a photo of my mother at the canal in August, squinting into the sun and smiling at whoever is behind the camera. That whoever is me. I am standing right there. I am not going anywhere.